everybody.
Hello, ma'am.
The Vice Chancellor and Professor Sharma, the Chair, Dr. Singh, all the technical staff who have been so helpful, and my fellow panelists, Dr. Kunjal, thank you for giving such a wonderful picture of what's happening in Mauritius. You are my neighbor. And to all the participants, I'm expecting some friends to join as well from South Africa, and also my brother from England, Jonathan, and his wife, Ghanem. I'm delighted and privileged to join you, and I thank you and the fellow panelists before me for doing this wonderful tribute to Gandhi. I've written, and many others have written in South Africa about the different aspects of Gandhi, and in this particular presentation, I'm focusing on a particular aspect. In this presentation, I shall consider the role of poetry in our political life. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Hello.
With reference to the challenges of justice and peace. I shall consider in particular, and most importantly, the role of spinning in the economy of the Satyagrahi's life. I conclude with poems I have composed on Gandhi and on Satyagraha. I begin with a poem, a very interesting poem from India itself. Gandhi, Spinning and Poetry. And this is the poem. One day, a lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. Gandhi, spinning away his thread towards Ram, took no notice of the poem waiting at his door, ashamed as he was no bhajan. The poem cleared his throat, and Gandhi looked at him sideways through his glasses that had seen hell. Have you ever spun thread, he asked? Ever pulled a scavenger's cart? Ever stood the smoke of an early morning kitchen? Have you ever starved? The poem said, I was born in the woods, in a hunter's mouth. A fisherman brought me up to this hamlet. Yet I know no work, I only sing. First I sang in the courts, then I was plump and handsome, but am on the streets now, half starved. That's better, Gandhi said, with a sly smile. But you must give up this habit of speaking in Sanskrit at times. Go to the fields, listen to the peasants' speech. The poem turned into a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil, moist with the new rain. Friends, this poem was composed by Dr. Satchit Anandan. It's an excellent translation into English from Malayalam. And in Dr. Satchit Anandan's poem, he's from Cochin, Gandhi is engrossed in spinning his thread towards the divine when he receives an unusual visitor, a poem. Gandhi tells the poem to go out into the real world and attune its ear to the sound of the peasants' talk and become something useful, to become grain. From poem to grain. Indeed, it is necessary to see how a poem may change its form and become grain, an agent of change. In South Africa, we are quite familiar with the political role that poets and artists have played in being the conscience of the nation. Many poets sacrificed their lives, died in exile, were imprisoned, suffered, had their words blanked out, were muffled, banned, and silenced. Yet their poetry and art were a stirring witness to the oppressive apartheid state. Our poetry spoke directly to the condition of injustice, oppression, pain, and suffering that was inflicted and endured. It is in this sense that poems are peace activists. Our protest and resistance poetry is alive to the society in which we are enshrined. Indeed, our poems have long turned into grain. However, the injunction of Gandhi in the poem above, and also to Tagore, remains. Let the poet spin. This is the very poet who was the first to call Gandhi the Mahatma. And nobody was more in tune than Tagore with the interrelated, interconnected world in which we live and which we should create. Indeed, Tagore's poems are prayers, words spun out of the very soul to the Creator. Tagore's prayers are the poetry of the soul. So what then did Gandhi mean? And why spinning? Firstly, spinning is a great leveling activity. Spinning reminds us of our interconnectedness. It reinstates the place of manual work. The physical activity that Gandhi encouraged was spinning. It constitutes a rich and diverse activity. Spinning is a useful, practical activity which leads to the production and creation of cloth. It is an indictment against the mechanization and depersonalization of labor that was our inheritance from the Industrial Revolution. Spinning is a powerful symbolic protest against the colonial enterprise that harvested raw material from the colonies and sent them to be processed in the dark satanic mills of Manchester, in the metropolis. In this, it is similar to the protests that Gandhi led through his salt marches. Without the spinning wheel, there is no Swadeshi. Swadeshi meaning self-sufficiency. If Gandhi's views on spinning were heeded, we would not be experiencing the deepening division between rich and poor, or the dire climate crisis we are in now, 100 years later. Spinning is about slowing down the body to the still point of deep realization of the meaning and purpose of life and living. Spinning is prayer. For Gandhi, spinning is an act of contemplation. And in contemplation, we move towards the divine, the transcendent. But we also move towards the world, to the immanent. Without the spinning wheel, there is no Swaraj, self-rule, in both its narrower individual senses and in its wider national understandings. And indeed, today we want to claim the global meaning of Swaraj, of self-rule. In spinning, Gandhi was dispelling the distinction between the secular and the sacred. Indeed, in spinning, as Gandhi saw it, the political, economic, spiritual, ecological, cultural, and aesthetic are deeply interwoven. They are deeply iterative, the weft and warp of our individual and collective lives, indeed our planetary and cosmic interweaving. And so here from the microcosm, we see how we reach out and connect to the macrocosm and to and fro. Gandhi was hereby reclaiming the unity of self, body, and mind, and positing a new way of knowing and a new way of being. Yes, spinning, anti-heroic, ephemeral, everyday, is yet deeply sacred. Here work is performed as consecration, as sacrifice. Here the gift of being occurs in the gift of doing. Finite tasks, such as spinning, begin to take on finite and infinite meanings. This is the training for the Satyagrahi. As Ajay Skaria, our professor who presented a few weeks ago, states cryptically in his book, Unconditional Equality, Satyagrahis must, he says, constantly practice the patience of groundless faith. Vandana Shiva, one of our great contemporary Gandhians, says, in this period of the end of the world, how do we sow the seeds of a possible world? The first, every person should recognize that working with their hands and their hearts and their minds and being interconnected is the highest evolution of our species. Working with our hands is not a degradation. It is our very humanity. This is the radical equality that Gandhi aimed for. It is from the center of the chakra that we spin cloth, spin subsistence, spin justice, spin peace, spin freedom, spin prayers, spin poetry, spin love. It is not surprising that the spinning wheel became the symbol of Indian independence. And the seed, as Vandana Shiva reminds us, is the symbol of our second independence. I'd like to conclude with a section of poems that I have composed, and I've chosen some which deal with the idea of spinning, of grain and soil. And I thought I would like to start for the benefit of all our participants from outside South Africa with a poem I have composed based on a description of Phoenix. This is from Sita Gandhi, a memoir, and as you know, Sita Gandhi was the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. Her father was Manilal Gandhi. Her sister Ela Gandhi continues to work very much in South Africa in many fronts and is a leading activist historically and at the present time. Well, this is a description of Gandhi's home at Phoenix, and I've entitled the poem, Gandhi's Earth, Phoenix at Dawn. And one day, if you visited me in South Africa and in Durban, I will be happy to take you to this ashram. The early morning breaks over the cluster of small white homes shrouded in shadows. A larger home of wood and iron, surrounded by a flower garden, quietly commands the allotment. At the edges of the homestead are large mango trees. In the center, a coconut palm and a Christmas tree. The printing press with its machinery now still will whirl into motion soon. The dogs are rousing while the calves edge closer to their mothers, standing erect with glazed eyes. From this sacred ground, the city is stirring, plotting machinations for the day. Here in this ashram, the rhythms of work and prayer are experiments with truths. And if you know the geography of the city, you'll realize that Phoenix, Gandhi's ashram, is a little outside the central business district. The next poem I'd like to read to you is called Satyagraha. You stand tall and still, clad in loincloth, stripped bare of pomp and the garlands of adulation. You took command and spoke in clear and simple words, believing in the force of your ideas rather than of a gun. Soul force is not the weapon of the weak, but the weapon of the strong. Soul force when will and heart and body and mind work in unison. Soul force, that alone could prevail against the gates of hell. Fired not with hate for the other, but with love for wholeness and humanity, with the strength to say, enough, we will not be trampled on like dust. We will be free. Another short poem entitled, A Heart of Flesh. A heart that is the pulse of progress goes back to the very source of the cosmic music to hear itself beat. The next poem is entitled Savodia, and you know this is based on the parable in the New Testament of the last person appearing on the fields to work being given the same amount as the first person who arrived to work. This was the parable that Jesus had told. Savodia. Unto this last I give the same as unto the first. He who worked from the first hour is equal to he who worked from the 11th. Both meet in the dignity of work and in the dignity of pay. The gift of bread for all is the bequest of peace for the world. And another poem entitled Song of Ascents. And Song of Ascents comes from the Psalms of always rising up. And yet the opposite is true as well of the work with the spinning wheel. It's about being grounded. And so there's the two forces of being rooted and always rising. Song of Ascents. It is not in erudite thoughts, but in the sinews of a spinning wheel. Serving my neighbor, I see truth's cause and freedom's gain. In women's sighs its liturgy, and widows' tears an altar for the sacrament of love. The next set of poems are Hind Swaraj poems, and I would like you to also notice the reference to grain there and truth. Hind Swaraj poems. We inherit the cosmos, sky, sea, and hallowed earth to hold in sacred trust. It is not in the state machine, but in self-rule that true Swaraj is found. Not in the gilded wealth of hoard houses, but in the scattering of grain on tilled soil. You and I are stewards of creation, threaded together with love. We find our calling in the dignity of nature and the manifold of work. The bonds are lifted. The pall of violence over each village dissipates. The air is suffused with reverential sighs, imbuing new destiny to the mundane. the state of livelihood is elevated to the stature of holiness, and truth is the force for the good of all. Two more poems. From prison houses degraded and coarsened, the human soul arises to seek justice without faltering, refusing the sacrilege of silence. Post blood on the lintels, mark the foreheads for peace, stave off the anarchy loosened on the world, and nurture a planet for bounty and bread. And finally, as you ply the thread on the spinning wheel, wrapped in contemplation, hands and minds in placable unison, you come to a hospitality of the heart towards yourself and your neighbor. Friends, may Gandhi's very life and those of the innumerable saints, both living and dead, may their lives and their life and their examples and their words turn into grain. And may my words and my poems turn into grain. Thank you.